All right, so today we're going deep on this one.
Oh, yeah.
We're tackling Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
It's a good one.
It is, and I think, the title can be a little misleading.
Absolutely.
It's not about being an apathetic jerk.
Yeah.
It's really about, I think, being very deliberate, right? About what you choose to care about.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're going to kind of unpack that, all the different nuances of that in this deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
What really struck me right off the bat was how Manson uses this story about a tombstone
Oh, yeah.
to kind of set the stage. And it's not just any tombstone.
Right.
It's Charles Bukowski's tombstone.
The poet laureate of Skid Row, as they called him.
And what's engraved on it, don't try.
Don't try.
Which, on the surface, that seems kind of strange.
Yeah, especially coming from a guy like Bukowski, right?
Exactly. This is a guy who, really embodied struggle.
Alcoholism, gambling, just, kind of scraping by for a good chunk of his life.
Yeah. Dead-end jobs, really like the antithesis of what we typically think of as success.
Right, the classic underdog story.
But then he becomes this acclaimed writer.
Yeah, novels, poems, really resonated with people.
So it's like, okay, what's the takeaway here?
Well, for Manson, it's about authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Like Bukowski didn't try to be somebody he wasn't. He didn't try to fit this mold.
He just was himself, flaws and all.
Exactly. And that rawness, I think, is what connected with people.
Yeah, it's refreshing, right?
Especially in a world where, everybody's trying to present this perfect image.
Oh, absolutely. The pressure to be perfect is everywhere.
Online, in real life, it's exhausting.
So this don't try idea, it's not about giving up.
Right.
It's more about letting go of that pressure to conform.
Yeah, to be something you're not.
To be something you're not, and just embracing who you are.
Finding that freedom in being your authentic self.
And it's interesting because that kind of leans into what Manson calls the feedback loop from hell.
Oh, yeah, this is a good one.
Which, essentially is this cycle of getting trapped in negative emotions.
You feel bad, and then you feel bad about feeling bad.
And it just keeps spiraling.
Yeah, you're like running on a treadmill getting nowhere.
He uses this example, I love this example, of him tripping on acid.
Oh, tell me about it.
And trying to walk to a house that keeps getting further away.
Oh, man, I can just picture it.
And it's that feeling of being stuck in your own head.
Trying to escape those negative feelings, but only making it worse.
Exactly. And this is where I think Manson really challenges that whole think positive mantra.
Yeah, it's not about ignoring or suppressing those feelings.
It's about acknowledging them, right?
Yeah.
Accepting them.
Without judgment.
Without judgment, yeah, like they're a part of the human experience.
If you never let yourself feel sadness, how can you really experience joy?
It's true, you need both, right? To appreciate the full spectrum.
Absolutely. Like light and shadow, you need both to see the whole picture.
Okay, so we're accepting our negative emotions. But then the question becomes, okay, how do we choose which problems are actually worth our energy?
Right, because we can't give a fuck about everything.
Exactly, and that's where this whole choosing your struggles idea comes in.
And the story of the old lady and the coupon.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
I mean, talk about a visual, right?
Yeah.
This woman throwing a fit over, 30 cents.
It's hilarious, but it also kind of makes you think.
Yeah, what are our 30-cent coupons?
What are we wasting our energy on? What are we willing to die on that hill for?
And on the flip side, what are the things that are truly worth fighting for?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What are those things that really matter to us?
And to help us figure that out, Manson introduces this character, the Disappointment Panda.
Oh, the Disappointment Panda. I love that guy.
This, brutally honest superhero who delivers uncomfortable truths.
He's like that friend who tells you what you need to hear, even if you don't want to hear it.
Exactly. And his main message, suffering is inevitable.
Oh, that's a tough one to swallow.
But the goal isn't to avoid problems altogether. It's to have, as Manson puts it, good problems to solve.
Problems that challenge us, help us grow.
That make us feel alive.
It's that feeling of accomplishment when you overcome something difficult.
It's not always fun in the moment, but it's rewarding.
Think about it. Even something as simple as stubbing your toe, it serves a purpose.
Right. It's a reminder to pay attention, to be more careful.
So maybe pain, in a way, is like a teacher.
It can be, if we let it.
Instead of trying to avoid it all the time.
Embrace it. Learn from it.
And then, of course, there's this whole question of, okay, how do we define success? How do we define happiness?
And are we measuring it the right way?
That's where the idea of values and metrics comes in, right?
Yep. Our values are what we find important, what gives our lives meaning.
And our metrics are how we measure our progress towards those values.
Manson uses this example of wanting to be a musician.
Oh, yeah, he was really drawn to that.
He loved the idea of it, the image of it, but
But he didn't actually enjoy the process.
right, he was so focused on the outcome that he lost sight of the actual experience
It's like he was chasing this external validation.
instead of connecting with what truly brought him joy.
And then he contrasts that with Dave Mustaine from Megadeth.
Oh, yeah, the guy who got kicked out of Metallica.
And you'd think, okay, he formed this hugely successful band.
Yeah, achieved what many would consider the dream
Dude was still miserable.
because he was constantly comparing himself to Metallica,
He was using the wrong metric to measure his success.
letting jealousy and resentment define his experience.
It's like even when we achieve what we think we want, it doesn't guarantee happiness if our values and metrics are out of whack.
Exactly.
And then there's the story of Pete Best, the fifth Beatle.
Oh, the drummer they fired right before they blew up.
You'd think he'd be full of regret.
Right, missing out on all that fame and fortune.
But he actually said he was happier than he would have been with the Beatles.
Wow.
He found a different kind of fulfillment.
One that aligned with his values, family, stability.
It really makes you think, right? What are we measuring our own lives by?
Are we chasing external validation? Or are we pursuing what truly matters to us?
What are our real metrics for success?
And are they leading us towards a life that feels truly fulfilling? Or are we just spinning our wheels?
Big questions.
Big questions. And I think that's a good place to maybe take a pause.
Yeah, let's let those questions kind of simmer for a bit.
And when we come back, we'll dive into another key aspect of this whole not giving effect thing.
The power of saying no.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Stay tuned.
Okay, so we were talking about values and metrics and kind of figuring out what really matters.
Right, like what are we actually striving for?
Exactly. And that kind of leads us to this other big idea from Manson, the power of saying no.
Which might seem kind of counterintuitive, right? When we're talking about like achieving our goals and all that.
Yeah, we're often told to say yes for opportunity, to be open to everything.
But Manson's argument is that saying no is actually a way to define what we value.
It's about setting boundaries, protecting our energy.
So we can focus on the things that actually matter to us.
And this can apply to all areas of life, really.
Work, relationships, even just like how we spend our free time.
It's about being intentional with our choices.
Manson even brings up Romeo and Juliet to illustrate this.
Oh yeah, the classic love story.
But he kind of flips it on its head, right?
He argues that it's actually a cautionary tale about the dangers of unhealthy boundaries,
Like they're so consumed by their love for each other.
that they lose sight of everything else.
And it ultimately leads to their downfall.
So it's a reminder that even in the most intense relationships, we need to maintain our own sense of self.
We need to have our own lives, our own interests outside of the relationship.
And this kind of ties into what Manson calls the difference between healthy and unhealthy love.
Right, like unhealthy love is often about trying to escape our own problems or insecurities,
By clinging to another person.
seeking validation and fulfillment externally instead of cultivating it within ourselves.
And this can lead to those classic victim and savior dynamics.
Where one partner is constantly trying to rescue the other.
And neither one is really taking responsibility for their own happiness.
They're both kind of trapped in this cycle of codependency.
And Manson's argument is that the only way to break free from that is to, well, not give a fuck.
Not in a heartless way, but in a way that allows you to detach from those unhealthy patterns.
To set those boundaries, to communicate your needs.
And to ultimately take responsibility for your own well-being.
So it's not about finding someone to complete you.
It's about finding someone who complements you, who supports you on your own journey.
And speaking of journeys, Manson also talks about his own experience with travel.
Oh yeah, he did a lot of that, right?
Yeah, he traveled all over the world, but he eventually realized that it wasn't really fulfilling him.
Like he was chasing these experiences, collecting them like souvenirs.
But he wasn't really connecting with anything on a deeper level.
He was all breadth, no depth.
Exactly, and that's what led him to the importance of commitment.
Okay, so how does that tie into the whole not giving effect thing?
Well, for Manson, commitment is actually a form of freedom.
Now that sounds kind of paradoxical.
But think about it. When we commit to something, we're actually freeing ourselves from the tyranny of choice.
That paradox of choice we talked about earlier,
Having too many options can be paralyzing.
we end up second-guessing ourselves, feeling overwhelmed.
But when we commit to something, we narrow our focus.
We can invest our energy in mastering a skill, nurturing a relationship, building something meaningful.
And that sense of purpose can be incredibly liberating.
So it's not about limiting ourselves.
It's about choosing what matters most and giving it our full attention.
Manson talks about this in the context of his own life, right?
Yeah, he decided to focus on his writing, his relationship, creating a sense of home in a specific location.
And that commitment brought him a level of satisfaction he hadn't experienced
He
before.
wasn't constantly chasing new experiences. He was present in the moment.
Engaging with the things that truly mattered to him.
And that allowed him to tap into that flow state, that feeling of being completely absorbed in a task.
Where time kind of disappears.
And you're just fully immersed in the present moment,
And that often happens when we're pushing ourselves beyond our comfort zones, right?
facing challenges, overcoming obstacles.
Manson even goes so far as to say that pain is a necessary part of growth.
He tells this fascinating story about Kazimierz Dabrowski, this Polish psychologist who studied World War II survivors.
Whoa, wow, that's heavy.
Yeah. And Dabrowski found that the people who thrived after experiencing such trauma were often those who embraced the pain.
They didn't try to avoid it or deny it.
They allowed themselves to feel it fully, to learn from it, to integrate it into their sense of self.
They turned their pain into a source of strength and resilience.
And this brings us to another important point that Manson makes: the difference between responsibility and fault.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
Taking responsibility for our problems doesn't mean blaming ourselves or feeling guilty.
It's about recognizing that we have the power to choose how we respond to the challenges we face.
He uses his own experience of being cheated on as an example.
Oof, yeah, that's a tough one.
He could have wallowed in self-pity, blamed his ex-girlfriend for his misery.
But instead, he chose to take responsibility for his own emotional well-being.
He started exercising, spending time with friends, and eventually he even recognized his own role in the relationship's demise.
So it's about owning our part in the story, even when we've been hurt by someone else.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective allowed him to move on and create healthier relationships in the future.
So even when we've been wronged, we still have the power to choose how we move forward.
We can choose to be victims, or we can choose to be empowered.
Powerful stuff.
And sometimes choosing to be empowered means embracing failure.
Now, that might sound a little crazy.
Right, like we're always told to avoid failure at all costs.
But Manson argues that our fear of failure can actually hold us back from living a truly fulfilling life.
He talks about how he graduated college during the Great Recession and struggled to find a job.
So he was basically starting his adult life as a failure.
Yeah, but he realized that this actually gave him a certain freedom
He had nothing to lose, so he felt less afraid to take risks.
to pursue his passions, even if they didn't lead to immediate success.
He asks this great question: if I try this thing and fail in a few years and have to go get a job anyway, will I have really lost anything?
And the answer, for him, was no.
He'd gain valuable experience, he'd pursue something he cared about, and he'd learn from his mistakes.
He talks about the failure-success paradox.
Okay, what's that all about?
Our fixation on achieving specific goals can actually limit our happiness.
We become so focused on the destination that we forget to enjoy the journey.
He uses the example of Pablo Picasso, who remained prolific throughout his long life because his metric wasn't about achieving fame or wealth.
It was about the process of artistic expression itself.
So Picasso was constantly challenging himself, experimenting and evolving because he wasn't afraid to fail.
He was more interested in the journey than in reaching some predetermined destination.
And this ties back to Manson's point about the importance of choosing the right metrics for measuring our lives.
Are we focused on external validation? Or are we pursuing what truly brings us joy and fulfillment?
It's a question worth pondering.
And speaking of pondering, Manson also talks about these VCR questions.
Oh yeah, I love those.
He gets emails from people who are stuck in situations that seem obviously solvable from the outside.
But they feel trapped by their own fear and anxiety.
Like the girl who hates med school but feels obligated to stay because her parents sacrificed so much for her education.
Or the guy who's crushing on his tutor but can't bring himself to ask her out.
Or the single mom whose adult children are still living at home but she's too afraid to ask them to move out.
Classic examples of where the action step is clear but the emotional hurdle feels insurmountable.
And Manson's point is that often the only way to overcome that hurdle is to just take action.
Even if it's scary or uncomfortable.
He talks about the action-inspiration-motivation loop.
We don't need to wait for motivation to strike. We can actually create motivation by taking action.
Even if it's just a small step.
The act of doing something, anything, can generate momentum and inspire us to keep going.
It's like jumping into a cold pool. It's shocking at first, but once you're in, you start to acclimate.
And you can start swimming.
And speaking of taking action, Manson also talks about his own experience of traveling the world and how he eventually realized that chasing novelty and experiences wasn't fulfilling him.
He felt like he was constantly searching for something, but he wasn't sure what.
He was pursuing breadth of experience without depth.
He was collecting experiences like souvenirs, but he wasn't really investing in anything meaningful.
And this realization led him to the importance of commitment.
He decided to focus on his writing, on his relationship, and on creating a sense of home in a specific location.
And this commitment, ironically, brought him a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced before.
He was no longer distracted by endless possibilities.
And he could pour his energy into the things that truly mattered to him.
So it's about rejecting the tyranny of choice.
The idea that more is always better.
Sometimes less is more. So we've been talking a lot about commitment, saying no, choosing our struggles.
Yeah, and it all kind of comes back to this idea of, like, what do we truly value?
Right, like what are the beliefs and principles that guide our decisions and actions?
And how do those values shape our experience of the world? Because Manson makes this point that, a lot of our values are based on beliefs that we formed from our experiences.
Which makes sense, right? We learn from what we go through.
But the thing is, those experiences are often limited, or even misinterpreted.
We can construct these whole belief systems around a single event or a handful of interactions.
And sometimes those belief systems might not actually serve us.
He shares this pretty intense story about a woman who became convinced that her father had sexually abused her as a child.
Whoa, that's heavy.
Yeah, and there was no evidence to support this claim.
So what happened?
Well, she'd been through a lot of trauma in her life, and she was undergoing this intense therapy that encouraged her to, dig deep into her subconscious and uncover repressed memories.
Okay, so in the process of trying to heal, she kind of created this narrative.
That fit her experience of pain, but it wasn't necessarily accurate.
It makes you realize how powerful our minds can be, right? Like, we can literally create our own realities.
And that's why Manson argues that we should be wary of certainty.
Certainty.
Yeah, when we become too attached to our beliefs, we close ourselves off to new information, to alternative perspectives.
It's like we put on these blinders and anything that challenges our worldview is just, rejected.
We stop questioning, we stop growing.
We become rigid in our thinking.
And you can see this play out everywhere, from personal relationships to politics.
Oh, absolutely. When people get too entrenched in their own ideologies, it's almost impossible to have a productive conversation.
Manson shares this funny anecdote about a woman he met at a self-help seminar who became convinced that they were soulmates, destined to be together.
Oh, wow, that's a bit much.
Right. And she was so certain that she was right about everything.
Like their relationship, the meaning of life, everything.
Everything. She'd read all the books, attended all the workshops, and she was living her life according to these self-improvement principles. But it had become so distorted.
So she was following the steps, but maybe missing the point?
Exactly. She was so focused on her own vision of how things should be that she couldn't see what was actually happening.
It's like she built this fantasy world in her head and then tried to force reality to fit into it.
And that's why Manson argues that we should be seeking doubt, not certainty.
Doubt? Isn't that like a bad thing?
Not necessarily. Doubt keeps us open to new possibilities. It allows us to learn from our mistakes.
It helps us evolve as individuals.
So it's not about becoming cynical or pessimistic.
It's about having a healthy skepticism, about questioning our assumptions.
And being willing to admit when we're wrong.
Because sometimes being wrong can be the best thing that ever happens to us.
It forces us to reevaluate our beliefs, to see things from a different perspective.
And to ultimately make better choices.
Manson even suggests that we should question our ideas about positive and negative experiences.
Like, what if the things we think are good for us are actually holding us back?
Exactly. And what if the things that seem challenging or painful are actually opportunities for growth?
It's a reminder that we don't always know what's best for us.
And our emotions aren't always reliable guides.
Sometimes we need to trust the process, even when it's uncomfortable or uncertain.
And that leads us to Manson's idea of becoming architects of our own beliefs.
Okay, I like that. How do we do that?
He describes this psychological experiment where people are put in a room with buttons to push and a light that flashes randomly.
Sounds simple enough.
But even though there's no actual pattern to the light flashing, the participants start creating these elaborate theories about how their actions are causing the light to flash.
So they're seeing patterns where there are none.
Exactly. They become convinced that they've figured out the system, even though it's completely random.
Which is kind of funny, but also kind of scary, right?
It reveals something profound about how our minds work. We're hardwired to find patterns to create meaning, even when there isn't any.
It's how we make sense of the world.
We're storytelling creatures, and we're constantly trying to connect the dots to create a narrative that explains our experiences.
But the danger is that we can get so caught up in our own stories that we lose touch with reality.
So how do we become more mindful of the stories we're telling ourselves? How do we avoid falling into the trap of certainty and dogma?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Manson provides 3 powerful questions to ask ourselves when evaluating our beliefs.
Okay, I'm listening.
First, what if I'm wrong? Second, why do I hold this belief? And third, would being wrong create a better or worse problem than my current problem?
Whoa, those are some deep questions.
They force us to confront our biases, to examine our motivations, and to consider the potential consequences of our beliefs.
They encourage us to step outside our own perspective,
And to entertain the possibility that we might not have all the answers,
which can be a humbling experience
but also a liberating one.
because it allows us to become more self-aware, more open-minded, more willing to change our minds,
It's about letting go of the need to be right all the time.
and embracing the messy, imperfect journey of personal growth.
And ultimately, that's what this whole subtle art of not giving a feck is all about.
It's not about being an apathetic jerk or embracing nihilism.
It's about taking responsibility for our own lives
Choosing our values wisely.
and focusing our energy on what truly matters.
It's about letting go of the need to control everything, to be perfect, to please everyone,
It's about embracing uncertainty
accepting our imperfections.
and finding freedom in the midst of life's inevitable challenges
It's about learning to say no to the things that drain our energy,
and distract us from our purpose.
so we can say yes to the things that light us up and make us feel truly alive.
It's about recognizing that our time on this planet is precious and finite.
And choosing to spend it on creating a life that is meaningful, fulfilling, and authentically our own.
It's about giving the right free
The ones that align with our deepest values.
and letting go of the rest.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a feck, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas
To challenge your own beliefs.
and to craft a life that reflects your unique values and aspirations.
Remember, it's not about being perfect.
It's about being present, being intentional, and being true to yourself.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep growing, and keep giving those right fecks.